Today we have a phenomenal A block that's all about sentencing reform. So a little bit of news you can use before we get into the conversation. Starting off here with our first slide. We are number one. It is a dubious distinction, but the U.S. has 2.3 million people behind bars right now. That's more than any other country in the world. Mandatory minimum sentences in the 80s helped to contribute to that population. As a matter of fact, in the 80s, federal prison populations ballooned from about 24,000 to over 214,000 folks in the federal prison system. To put that into perspective, in the U.S., there are about 1 in every 100 folks in our country is an inmate somewhere. Sentences for both nonviolent and violent crimes have grown at about the same rates. Moving on to our second slide here, we're still number one, and there's no parole in the federal criminal justice system. Those mandatory minimums mean that folks have to serve a certain percentage of their time, and there's definitely not any parole there. Half of all federal prisoners are serving sentences for drugs. We know all about those Rockefeller laws here in New York State and how they impacted us. Same thing on the federal level. And in 2012, 90% of all federal offenders received a sentence of imprisonment. That means only 10% of folks walked out of the courtroom not going into jail. Last slide here coming up. The advocate wish list. There are a lot of good, well-meaning people on both sides of the aisle working for sentencing reform, and on their wish list are avoiding new mandatory minimum sentences, giving judges more leeway in how folks are prosecuted or penalized, actually. They want to address the special needs of those who are addicted or mentally ill, veterans, and survivors of domestic abuse who get caught up in the penal system. Federal focus prison resources on kingpins and major drug offenders and runners, folks who are at the top of that pyramid, not people who have low-level offenses. But they also want to focus special attention also on people who commit gun crimes and gun violence, looking at applying minimums to them and avoiding unfair limitations on just who qualifies for the relief that would come from these reforms. So take you back to our title page. We're talking sentencing reform in a country where more people are in prison than any other place in the world. Melody.
So that's the national story, but New York has been and continues to be a hotspot in the war on drugs. To help us analyze how the state sentencing guidelines work and how reform would apply to our local laws, we're joined by Kate Mogilescu, supervising attorney for the Legal Aid Society. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we want to welcome back civil rights attorney Nicole Bellina, partner at Stoll, Glickman, and Bellina. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you.
Thank you both for joining us. So you guys are both lawyers. What's the most common sentencing problem you guys face on a regular basis?
I'd say on the felony level, on the more serious offense level, the biggest issue is not having any discretion. Clients and people who are charged with crimes have all kinds of different issues that bring them into a courtroom. And those issues are often involve mental illness. It can involve all kinds of things but unfortunately, the mandatory laws and sentencings really restrict the court's ability to look at individual cases and be flexible on how to deal with them.
So I watch a lot of Law and Order. So that's my that's my main reference point. But do you feel like judges feel like their hands are tied? Because I'm sure, knowing that there are these minimums, you still present sort of mitigating things. But do judges ever express, I'm sorry, this is just the way it is?
Absolutely. I mean, what we see on the state level, in addition, is that prosecutors hold a lot of the control. They control charges. Mm-hmm. They control ultimately what charges people are facing in the courtroom, and that directly impacts what sentence you might be eligible for. So judges feel a lot of frustration because really they can't wrest that power out of the hands of the prosecutor, even in a case where they do think someone might be deserving or merit a lesser sentence. So prosecutorial discretion plays a huge role in how cases are resolved and what ultimately people are sentenced to.
So the prosecutors actually have more power than the judges then, because they're the ones who bring the charges.
In many instances, yes. In many instances, yes. And so, sentencing reform, while critical, both at the federal and state level, I mean, you mentioned the Rockefeller drug framework, it's a very important part of our criminal justice reform, but there are many other many other examples of dynamics in the criminal justice system that need to similarly be examined if we're going to really get at who is in jail and why. And sentencing reform doesn't quite encompass all of that.
Like what, Kate?
Well, there are a few things that come to mind immediately. The first is, we've already talked about prosecutorial discretion, bail reform. Right? You need to understand how it is that people even end up getting sentenced. So many cases in our criminal justice system are resolved by guilty pleas. Right? Cases don't proceed to trial. Law and Order does do us a disservice here
Everyone
with those
gets their day in court.
the dramatic trial moments that end each episode. Right? That doesn't actually come to pass in criminal court. Many cases are resolved by plea bargaining, and one of the biggest factors as to why someone may ultimately accept a plea
To get off Rikers.
is if they are detained awaiting trial. Bail reform, right? Keeping people incarcerated while they are awaiting trial because they cannot afford to pay bail.
Right.
Is a critical point at the process that we need to be looking at. Similarly, funding indigent defense systems, making sure that lawyers for people who cannot afford them are competent, are resourced, and can really test the validity of the charges that are brought against someone. That's another point that deserves more attention and scrutiny in the conversation.
So looking at these reform efforts, we were reading about these sort of two roadblocks. One, the law and order types who don't want to appear soft on crime, and another of this sort of like add-on of the mens rea whole issue of getting corporate people a sort of shield against prosecution. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, the issue, I mean, specifically about the mens rea issue, I mean, it is completely a red herring in this argument about the federal bill that's hopefully going to pass and is a great step forward. I think it's really just a way to, sneak in something that's really not relevant.
It's nothing to do with it.
It has nothing to do with it. It really is completely unrelated and shouldn't stop that bill whatsoever. As far as the other issue, right, it's a common concern that we always hear when you talk about sentencing reform, and that's this, it's going to be soft on crime. And I feel like everyone keeps saying the same thing, which is we're mostly talking about nonviolent offenders. All the statistics, all of the studies show that the community is in fact safer when we help people come back into our communities in a safe, healthy way with resources and support. It keeps all of us safer as it keeps the recidivism rate down. So that argument fails every time, but it seems to always come up anyway.
Right, because that's the other thing. How does our sentencing structure affect people's lives afterwards?
Drastically. On the sort of small scale, people who are doing, a year or less, let's say, on a sentence, housing is the first huge thing. You come out of jail, you can't go back to your housing most of the time. You've lost your place, you've lost, your family connections. Sometimes even the simplest, smallest things like your property. I've had so many clients who spend, 60 days, 90 days in jail. They come out. Now, what happened to that room they were renting that now they've been kicked out of? Now their ID is gone. Without ID, you can't get resources. I mean, it's just a vicious cycle. And we have, on a bigger scale, people who are doing longer sentences in state facilities. There's a lot of rules now about when you come out of jail where you can live. For example, even low-level sex offenders, they can't live near a school, or they can't live near here. There are many inmates who are still in jail upstate past their sentences because they can't find quote-unquote approved housing.
So
it happens all the time.
Three-quarter and the halfway house that you need as a part of your readjustment. And they have to stay there on our dime as a taxpayer. So in the same sort of vein, we had a conversation here last week about Rikers and the push to close Rikers. And just this seems like one of the factors in sort of doing an in-run around even closing Rikers. If we can reform sentencing before people get stuck in that log jam. So what do you guys think about this as a possible solution, or at least something to help ease the problem at Rikers, the sentencing reform?
So, I mean, I think sentencing reform would work together with bail reform and the other things we've talked about to reduce the jail population at Rikers. It would directly apply to people who are awaiting trial on felony charges. The bigger question in my mind is how we reduce the jail population for people who are facing lesser offenses, lower level offenses, misdemeanors, which is a significant number of people in our city, right? Misdemeanor policing, which has really governed our policing strategy in New York City for the last 20 plus years, right, puts a lot of people in jail for low-level offenses as well. Sentencing reform won't address that. The only thing that will realistically address that is a change in our policing strategy.
This is broken windows.
Exactly.
Years on.
Exactly. So while sentencing reform is important for people facing felony offenses, people who are arrested on lower-level crimes.
Just the point of entry stuff.
Exactly. Exactly.
Last year, Cuomo said that the revisions to the Rockefeller drug laws had taken out a lot of nonviolent inmates from our prison system, and it just doesn't seem like that's really what we're seeing or hearing. Is that true, that 18,000 nonviolent inmates were released in the past few years?
I think there has been a decrease, and that's something that politicians can certainly, hang their hat on to say it's been exactly that there's been a decrease. But again, I think it's looking at mostly upstate prison populations. It's not looking at what most of us hear about all the time, which is the Rikers population. None of that touched what's happening at Rikers, and of course, there's always still a lot of movement that we need.
So on the same vein, this was just something like reading one of the rags on the way in the other day. There's this ad here for the Department of Corrections. And like New York is sort of bucking the trend because our populations are going lower in people incarcerated, but we're still preparing by recruiting folks to become corrections officers. They have full-page ads saying, come take the test, we're going to be hiring these people. But I can't think of the last time I saw one of these for teachers or people who are doing public service in a way that's not penalizing folks. Is this any sort of indicator of what the environment is like that you're trying to work in?
I mean, I think that there is a tremendous economic dependency between certain sectors and our prison, our prison industrial complex, right? We know that the employment that's generated by jails and prisons is significant, and it's significant to certain communities that do actually need employment.
The economy of St. Louis is,
So I don't want to be dismissive of that. I'm not sure that the ad is necessarily an indicator of the Rikers Island jail population increasing or decreasing. I mean, we see what the general trends are there. But there is a constant need for people to work in jails and prisons because there are constantly people entering jails and prisons.
And I think it's a very tough job, and there's a lot of turnover. And when a lot of people talk about closing Rikers and making it a safer place, it's also about making it a safer place for the correction officers who are there trying to do the right thing. Yeah. And they will benefit by less people in jail. They will benefit by, maybe a smaller facility where they know the inmates, where they know, that you can build relationships. They will benefit by better security so that there's not, weapons and drugs and all kinds of things getting smuggled in. So I think they have a lot of turnover because it is a difficult job, and that's part of why, there is this movement to try to shut down Rikers and make things better.
So if we're sort of in a critical place, do some triage for a second. Where would you put the resources immediately from your perspectives? Like you talked about that three-headed monster, the sentencing, the bail stuff. Like where should we focus our money and our attention right now?
I think on the bail reform and we have to look at reducing the population on Rikers, and by doing that is by sentencing reform in the misdemeanor context, as we were talking about. You will see individuals come through the system who get arrested over and over again for small things, jumping a turnstile, a small amount of drugs, maybe selling a small amount of marijuana, and there's no options of what to do with these individuals. And so what happens? I'll give you 30 days this time. You just got arrested 6 months ago, 45 days this time, right? And it just snowballs, and their rap sheets are getting thicker, so each time they get arrested, it gets worse, and the population in Rikers continues to balloon with all of these small sentences because there's no other options. It's literally the courts, they just don't know what else to do with these kinds of individuals that are just getting recycled through the system. I think that would be a fantastic place to focus some energy.
Okay.
I would also suggest that, given exactly what you've identified, right, the large number of people who are currently incarcerated or who have been incarcerated, we need to focus some resources on what is now termed reentry, right? Eliminating barriers for those people that have formerly been incarcerated or are coming home soon from obtaining employment, right, pursuing education, obtaining stability in their lives that often so many obstacles are presented by the mere fact that they have a criminal record, right? We see this devastating impact time and time and time again. So there's great movement in some states to limit the way employers can discriminate on the basis of a criminal record, but our discussion, but our discussion needs to go here. There are so many barriers on formerly incarcerated people that if we're really thinking about changing direction here, we must provide resources and support for people coming home.
Right.
Thank you.
Especially when we're also talking about things like addiction or mental illness or a history of abuse, you know? Do you guys think that the act that's kind of waiting in the wings will address any of these things appropriately?
So that's the Federal Sentencing Reform Act, which I am very hopeful that will work to reduce sentences for people who are incarcerated on drug offenses in the federal system. However, here in New York State, right, the federal law would not impact our local practice. It obviously sets the right tone for the direction we should be heading in, but it would not impact people incarcerated in state prison here in New York.
Okay, so then we still have a lot to take on here.
All right, I guess that's why they're trying to convict El Chapo here. They want to get him into the Brooklyn courts. I'm saying it's a thing. I read the papers. All right, thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.